These are, again, another big question I get is, well, all right, I'm ready to do a contract. The broker wants to use their form, and my students will say, Mike, you gave me this template. Which should I use? And the truth is, again, I will defer to the broker under most circumstances. If I use my form, I prefer to use mine because ours is written clearly in our favor. But if they're going to use theirs, I'm not going to, I'm not going to make it hard. So I'll agree to use theirs and say, yeah, no, that's perfectly fine. I just have a couple specific clauses that I'd like to tack on to the end as an addendum, if that's okay. And they'll always be okay with that. And these are two of those clauses. The first one is purchase price allocation. I'm going to go through this real quick, but the bottom line is your property taxes are based on the number that you put in that first blank space, the real property. So if you buy a self-storage facility for $750,000 that used to be assessed by the taxing authority for half that, $375,000, your property taxes are basically going to double for you within your first year of ownership. On the other hand, self-storage is valued based on the income and the customer list and the seller's goodwill, their willingness not to compete with you by opening a storage facility next door. So if you were to put in that real property line, $375,000, and then allocate $375,000 to split it up and divide it to goodwill, covenant not to compete, customer list, and trade name, it's not going to negatively impact the seller's taxes from an income tax standpoint in any way, and your property taxes are going to stay the same. I've used that little clause right there. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you it's worth tens of thousands of dollars. So make sure that's in your contract. The one caveat I'll say is don't put a lot of money. I'll usually put $1 or $1,000 to inventory and equipment because the seller will pay extra income tax on those line items. The next clause that's critically important, I'm not going to go through the whole thing. You guys can pause the video at some point on the replay and read through it. It's typical prorations, which just means if you close middle of the month, the seller gets pays taxes for the first half of the month, and you as the new owner pay taxes for the second half of the month. That's true for income and expenses. That one highlighted sentence in there that won't always make it to the finish line, but if it does, it can quite literally be worth thousands of dollars, depending on the size of the facility. What it says is all accounts not yet paid in delinquent 30 days or less are to be considered paid for proration calculations. So what that means is, let's say you close on a facility on the 5th of a month. I will tell you, having owned a lot of storage facilities, that there's a large percentage of your customers that pay between the 5th and the 10th. Because the 5th is when they get locked out and the 10th is when they get a late fee. So they're not all that incentivized to pay before the 5th. If they're on auto pay, they will have already paid. But there could be 50% of your rent comes in after the 5th of the month. You close on the 5th. The prorations with this sentence in here are treated such that all of that money has been paid and you're entitled to 25 days out of the 30 days because you closed on the 5th. Then you own the property, and thereafter, if those folks pay the rent again, that's yours as the new owner. The other thing that you've got in here is all accounts not yet paid in delinquent 30 days or more shall become the property of the buyer with no proration, which means if there's someone who's 4 months behind and you buy the property, the old owner has no right to that 4 months of past due rent any longer. It becomes yours and you have the ability to collect it. Does that make sense? So again, if a savvy investor saw these, they would pull them out. Like if you try to buy one of my storage facilities with this in here, trust me, it's not making it through. I'm going to X them out. And that's not a deal breaker. You still go through with the deal. It's just an opportunity for you to get the best deal possible. The one other big clause, and this is the one that changes so much, really depending on the sophistication of the seller, what they're going to have. You may not get a lot of these documents, but the most important part is the last line, especially if you're rushing to an offer. Say, for example, there's a property that gets listed and it's a home run deal and you know it, and you know other people are interested, then you might be making an offer before you know beyond a shadow of a doubt that there's not a fatal flaw. There might be something wrong with this property, and you need time to dig deeper, you just don't want to take that time before you get it locked up. That's where this clause really comes in, because one, it spells out all of the information they need to give you, and you got to be reasonable. Some of this stuff they're just not going to have. If they're 90 years old and they've been, they've owned it forever, there's not going to be a site plan necessarily. They probably built it without one, for heaven's sake. Copy of building plans may not be there. It's all negotiable. I'm not telling you you have to get all this stuff. I'm saying you list it all, and it's part of the discussion during negotiations. But the critical part that I started to allude to is that your due diligence period doesn't start until you get the last document that they agreed to give you. So a lot of times I have students that are nervous about like a 15-day due diligence period. Well, we know more often than not that a seller is going to take 2 weeks to get us these documents. So you can start due diligence and do a lot of the investigative work while these documents are trickling in, and you'll end up having 3 or 4 weeks to do your due diligence. So again, this is important to include, and it's never, they'll have an inspection period listed in like a broker's typical, if they're using a generic state or county template, it'll have an inspection period, but it won't have this list of documents that you do want to include.